Good morning, everyone. Um, I'm Jonathan, um, and I'm going to start off by telling some stories about when I was in high school. Um, when I was a freshman in high school, I was a long distance runner, and I remember I was kind of fast. Um, my fastest mile time was like 5 minutes, and my fastest 2 mile time was like around 11 minutes, and that's kind of fast. I was like 15. Um, And I used to really enjoy that until I realized that I didn't actually enjoy it because my coaches were very brutal. Um, I remember the craziest thing that happened was when I was a freshman. I was brought up to do a varsity race, and the coaches said, this is going to be a 5K, and we want you to run the entire race right before you actually run the race, and you got to be in sweats. And it was 90-degree weather at the time, and so I was running with the varsity guys the whole race, and I didn't do well in the actual race. I was exhausted. I was so tired. But that was like a contributing factor to me. It was like, you guys are crazy. Why are you having me run the entire race in sweats in 90-degree weather? Um, I remember my teammates were also pretty intense. One guy tried to run 1,000 miles over the summer, and he severely injured himself while trying to do that, and he couldn't participate that year. But we had some pretty intense people, um, and the program I was a part of was pretty crazy. We would run 7 to 10 miles a day, and at 15 years old, I couldn't really handle that, and so I decided to quit. I was like, I don't, you know what? This isn't fun. I don't enjoy this. This is like hours and hours of my time every day, um, running in a straight line. Very boring. And on top of that, the coaches were kind of mean. They weren't like encouraging coaches. And so I quit. And looking back, I probably suffered from like not eating enough food because I mean, like that's a crazy amount of energy to spend every single day. And I was also doing some research, and it turns out our training was more training than people who train for marathons. So it was kind of wild. Oh, yeah, did you want to say something? Oh, they did do the Ironman yesterday? That's crazy. Yeah, I had some friends who would do the Ironman, and I never understood how they were able to do it. But I mean, the biking part's cool. To me, that seems like the most fun part. But the swimming is probably the hardest. Yeah, 13 miles. That's a half marathon, right? Yeah. Marathons always fascinated me as a kid, but I never wanted to do one. Um, but do you think marathon runners, they can just, uh, maybe like I could wake up in the morning, do you think I could just run a marathon today if I wanted to? Is that humanly possible? It's, it's not exactly. And there's a story because the first guy who ran a marathon, you remember what happened to him? He, it didn't go so well for him. This was a story from 500 BC. The Persians were invading the Greeks, and the Greeks had an important victory at the battlefield of Marathon. And a messenger named Phidippides ran about 26 miles to Athens to declare Nike, Nike. He was declaring victory. And when he made it to Athens, he died. Um, because, I mean, that's a very long distance to run. And so marathon runners, they go through a very specific regiment when they train for this. They start really slow, just running a couple miles a day, and they go through this for 18 weeks. They slowly ratchet it up. Around halfway through, they run a half marathon, and then they kind of de-escalate that, and they don't ramp up even further. They de-escalate so they can preserve themselves to run the marathon. But it takes a long time. So what do marathon runners have that maybe I don't have? What virtue do marathon runners have? What do you guys think? Yeah, they have perseverance. Well, the guy who ran the first marathon, he had perseverance, but then he died. So the marathon runners today, they have something a little more than perseverance, I think. I think they have something called endurance, because when they have endurance, they can not only finish the race, but they don't die at the end of the race. They can survive. Um, but yes, it takes a lot of perseverance to do that. Um, and so my topic for today is endurance. And we're going to be reading from James, the beginning of James. And I'll read the first couple verses of James. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Um, Now, other translations have different words there. Do any of you guys have different words other than endurance? You have patience? Is that the New King James Version? Did someone say stamina? Stamina? James 1. We're in verse 4. Some translations say steadfastness, some say perseverance. In my opinion, I like endurance. And the actual Greek word, I'll try and explain what the actual Greek word is here. The testing of your faith, when you go through various trials, it produces endurance. The Greek word here means to undergo trials. So when you undergo trials, you gain in this ability to undergo trials. You get this thing called undergoing this. Now in English, that doesn't make much sense. That word doesn't exist in English. And so when you can undergo many difficult things, we say you have endurance. And as Christians, what are some difficulties that we might have to undergo today? Temptation, that's one of them. Persecution, yeah. There's all sorts of trials that we have to go through and all sorts of ways that we suffer today. But if we undergo temptation, like you said, how does endurance help us? Focusing on God's word. Yep. Perfect. And when we go through persecution, how does endurance help us with that? Okay, so God doesn't put us through extremely extreme circumstances. Did I see a hand over here or no? No, I thought I saw one. That's fine. When we continue reading in James, we're in chapter 1, verse 12, he talks about endurance again. Blessed is the man who who has endurance under trial, for he has stood the test, and he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. So endurance has this end result of us receiving the crown of life. And Paul also agrees with James here. In Romans 2, he says, God rewards each man's work. And he lists all of these things that we can do. And when we have endurance, the end result of endurance is immortality. So when we endure through temptation and when we endure through persecution, those things don't last forever. Those things will, if we endure those things, we will have eternal life. Okay, so how can we build endurance? Since endurance is a good thing to have, we're going to be blessed. How can we build endurance? Yes. Okay. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, this word here that's used to undergo trials, it's definitely not like uh, you're not supposed to be bitter going through the trials. You're supposed to be joyful while going through trials. But how do you think us as Christians can build endurance? Through prayer, yes. Any other ways we can build endurance? Living long enough, yeah. Yes, that does help. I don't have a lot of endurance because I'm still pretty young. Oh, yes. And then you. Yes. Did you have something? That's right. Yeah, we can have endurance by going through things together, and we can build endurance through Jesus who gives us strength. Yes. Avoiding distraction. Yes, that's also very good. Um, one way that we can build endurance, now we may not like this, is we have to go through training and we have to go through trials to build endurance. And it seems almost like, I don't know, kind of circular, that we have to go through tough times to help us endure through more tough times. And the Bible kind of talks about this a little bit. Paul says in Romans, we boast in our suffering because we know that suffering produces endurance, and endurance helps us go through more suffering. And even in James, that we're reading here in verse 2, uh, when we encounter trials, the testing of our faith is going to produce endurance. Um, but obviously, none of us will, none of us really enjoy suffering. That'd be kind of weird if we enjoyed suffering. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. So when you succeed, uh, you get sort of lifted up and encouraged. But it's hard to have joy in suffering. But as we're reading it here in James, he talks about have joy when you go through trials. And there's many other places in the Bible that talks about having joy in suffering. And that just seems like something that just feels wrong. Like, why are you happy when bad things happen? That feels like, I don't know, it just feels kind of messed up. But why is joy the secret? Why should we have joy when we suffer? What does that do for us? Yeah, Jesus had joy on the cross. Yeah, um, and that's incredible. That's incredible. But oh yes, yep, yep. We can have joy because we know that we're going to receive the crown of life. Um, Now, I'm a teacher, and I've seen that having joy can really help people. I'm a math teacher, and most of my kids uh, don't really enjoy math, and so when they're, I don't know, when they're in a bad mood, do you think that's going to help them with the class? Not really. But if I do things that make them excited and have joy, do you think that helps them learn a little bit? Yeah. So joy is kind of like a superpower. Um, it's very useful. But having joy when it's hard to have joy is very difficult. Because it's like, would you guys naturally enjoy doing mathematics? They're shaking their heads no. And would we naturally have joy in suffering? We're not going to. He's shaking his head yes. Please tell us your wisdom. How do you do this? Um, but if you're someone who loves to run, that's going to give you a better chance of being a good runner. If you love doing math, I like math because I'm a math teacher. It's going to give you a better opportunity to do math. And if you have joy in suffering, that's going to help you build endurance and help you get through more suffering. But if you view it as a grind, then you're going to be filled with bitterness. Because if I force Titus to do math, is he going to really enjoy that, or is he going to be kind of bitter at me? It's going to be a little bitter. So it's hard to have joy, and it's easy to grow weary and not have this endurance. So how can we stay joyful? How are ways that we can be inspired to be joyful? By playing fun sports, yeah. By doing things that give you joy. What are some other ways that can help us be joyful? Again? Okay. Yeah. By playing video games in moderation. I mean, sometimes that can help some of us, you know. Um, what are some other ways that we can have joy? Did you want to say something? Singing can give us joy, yes. Yeah. At camp, we did a lot of singing, and that was really uplifting. Did you guys like the singing at camp? Yeah, it was very fun. That's very encouraging. Oh, yeah? Helping people in need, yes. That can give us joy when we give other people's joy. Yeah. Yeah. When we go through suffering and we have joy through it, we can be examples for other people and help inspire other people. And that's something very important that we'll be talking about very soon. Um, Now, Vic mentioned this earlier. One way we can gain endurance and be joyful is reading the Bible, and that's kind of like a cop-out answer, but it's also very true. But when I read the Bible, there's a very large chunk of it called the Old Testament that I kind of have trouble reading, um, and I sort of feel like I have to have endurance reading through all this because it's like, whoa, that's a lot. It's very big. Um, and so it's like, why did God give us this ginormous Old Testament? Like, what's up with that? Why do we have this? And how does reading it help us out? Okay, so we have lessons in the Old Testament that can help us out. What other ways is the Old Testament useful? Because I don't know. In my opinion, some of it is harder to read. Yeah, Proverbs has a lot of wisdom. Yeah, okay. There's a lot of wisdom in the Old Testament. Some things about the Old Testament, it shows us prophecies about Jesus. Yes, that's really cool. The scriptures teach us about basic morality. That's really cool too. But one reason why I think the Old Testament is really important is something that maybe we don't think about that much, but I'm going to read from Romans 15. If I can find it, I got it. Romans 15, 4 through 5. For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance and that through encouragement, the encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope. May the God of endurance and encouragement grant you to live in such harmony with one another. So the Old Testament was written that we may have endurance. And it's like, okay, so how do we gain endurance from the Old Testament? And since we're reading in James still, James gives us a hint of how the Old Testament can give us endurance, and it's through example. In James 5, verses 10 and 11, as an example of suffering and endurance, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who have endurance. You've heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you've seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. So we have so many examples in the Old Testament of people displaying endurance, and those people can help encourage us. And now someone said, when we go through suffering ourselves, when we go through trials ourselves and we have joy, we can be an example to other people. And in the same way, the Old Testament is filled with examples of people who've suffered and who can give us encouragement when we read those examples. And so I'm going to read some examples for us. I'm going to go through the entire Old Testament. So we have Noah, who lived in a very violent generation, full of wickedness, and God called him to build an ark and he had to build this for 120 years, and he preached for these 120 years, and nobody followed his teaching, and so only him and his family were saved. But I can imagine that he suffered tremendously by living in this generation of people who were very violent. There was Abraham, who was called away from his homeland to live as a nomad. He had to live in tents, and that probably wasn't very comfortable for him. He wasn't blessed with kids until he was 90 years old, and when he was finally blessed with children, God said, you know what, you got to kill Isaac. And I can't imagine that he was extremely joyful about this, but God promised that through Isaac, the world would be blessed. And so Abraham reckoned to himself, he's like, you know what, I think God is able to raise the dead. And so that's why he was able to do this. You have Job, who he was very wealthy, but he was attacked by raiders and all of his possessions were stolen. A powerful wind came and destroyed a house where all 10 of his kids were in, and they all died. And he was cursed with boils from head to toe. And I can't imagine that he was very happy about this. His friends looked at him and said, you know what, this must be happening because you did something wrong. And so even his friends weren't really encouraging him through this. And not once did he curse God, but instead he said something that I think is incredible. He said, though God slays me, I will trust in him. Joseph is another person who went through suffering. His brothers were jealous of him, and they beat him up and tossed him in a pit. And they were going to kill him, but the oldest brother sold him into slavery, which is not much better. And even though he was enslaved, Joseph gained respect from Potiphar. He acted righteously, but then he was falsely accused of harassment, and so he's thrown in prison. And even while he's imprisoned, he didn't have bitterness, but he remained trustworthy, and he gained the respect of those who were in prison. He was made to be like the leader of those in prison, which I don't even know what that means. But eventually he became second in command. And so he said, when he met his brothers finally in the end, he said, you did this thing out of evil, but God turned it into something good. Moses, he was blessed to live in Pharaoh's household, but he instead chose to not live with Pharaoh's household, and he chose to live with the Israelites. He wanted to be mistreated alongside them with his own people. But he ended up killing an Egyptian, and he fled, and God told him, you know what, you have to go back, and you have to challenge the most powerful man in the world face to face to let God's people go. And I can't imagine he was too excited about that. The Bible tells us he was the opposite of excited about that. He was trying to make excuses. But God blessed him through that with the plagues. And so he had all 600,000 people traveling through the wilderness, and they had a fantastic time together, right? No. Moses had to deal with a lot with these people who loved idolatry and loved crazy things. And in the end, Moses was barred from entering the promised land. He didn't even get to go into the promised land, which when I was a kid, I was kind of sad about that. I was like, what? Why? We have Joshua. He was born a slave in Egypt, and he was one of the 12 spies who went out into the land, and one of the only 2 who reported back and said, you know what, we can take these guys. The other 10 said, no, these guys are descendants of the Nephilim. They're too powerful for us. And so God had the Israelites traveling in the wilderness for 40 years, and so Joshua was suffering through something that he didn't even deserve to go through. But he was chosen to succeed Moses, and he was very afraid about that because he was tasked to conquer the entire promised land. But God encouraged him. He said, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. We have King David, who, as a boy, he was anointed to become the next king of Israel, and he defeated Goliath, so he had a lot of faith to do that. But King Saul, he didn't really like that. He was jealous of David, and so for years King Saul tried to kill David, and I can't imagine David was excited about that either. David had to live in caves, but even though he was trying to be killed by Saul, David had the opportunity to kill Saul twice, but he didn't. He didn't want to hurt the Lord's anointed. But David went through a lot of things. He was betrayed by his friends. His sons tried to kill him. And even though David endured all these things, he was still a man after God's own heart. Elijah was an amazing prophet. He did many miracles. You may remember he challenged the priest of Baal on Mount Carmel, and he was making fun of the priests who they thought they could get their God to set an altar on fire, and he was like, haha, your God must be using the restroom or something. He's like on vacation. And they spent all day trying to get their God to set it on fire, but they couldn't. And Elijah, he had his altar, and he said, douse it in water. And they did that, even though it had been a drought for 7 years or so. And he prayed to God, and God immediately destroyed the altar. All the stones were disintegrated. And after that, do you think God's people were like, yes, go Elijah? They may have been, but Queen Jezebel, she was like, you know what, let's kill Elijah. And so Elijah ran away, and he went through severe depression. But he was encouraged by God. But he had to live under constant threats of being killed by wicked rulers. Jeremiah was someone who had to go through a lot of suffering. He was repeatedly imprisoned and thrown into pits and thrown into Jonathan's dungeon. But he stayed faithful even through all that suffering. Daniel was someone who, when he was young, he was taken captive and enslaved to Babylon. He was threatened with death several times. You may remember they said, you have to eat this fantastic feast, and he said, no, I'm not gonna touch it. I just want vegetables. And the baker said, well, you have to eat this, otherwise the king's gonna kill us. But he said, you know what? Let me eat veggies and see after 10 days if we're stronger and healthier than everyone else. And God blessed him. And there was a law made saying, you can't pray to your gods for a full month. You got to pray to the king. And Daniel, instead, with the door wide opened, he prayed to God, and immediately he was captured and thrown into the lion's den. And he did that willingly, even though he didn't have to. He could have shut the door, do it in secret. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when the entire city was bowing down before an idol of gold, they didn't. And instead they said to the king, they were like, you know what? You could kill us, and it's not going to matter. We're still not going to bow down. We don't care about our own lives. And so they were thrown into a fiery furnace, but they were saved. And so we have many examples in the Old Testament of people who suffered. And we also have some in the New Testament as well. People who suffered tremendously, just like unimaginable things. John the Baptist was someone who suffered a lot. He lived in the wilderness. He ate grasshoppers, kind of disgusting. And for some reason, he was like preaching, and he said something about Herod, about him being unfaithful to his wife. And so he's imprisoned, and you remember that, I don't know, Herod's daughter asked for him to be beheaded. We have the 12 apostles, and they went through severe persecution. Jesus said that you guys are going to be persecuted for my name, but those who have endurance will be saved. And many of them were imprisoned, beaten, and a lot of them were crucified too, in strange ways. You have Stephen, the first martyr. I'm going to be a little emotional going through this because a lot of these people suffered in tremendous ways. I was studying this last night, and I was crying last night. I was like, you know what? I'm probably going to cry today, but that's okay. I'm tearing up a little bit. Stephen, he preached Jesus to his own enemies, who falsely accused him. And he said, Lord, do not hold this sin against them, when he was being stoned by them. Paul was persecuted in many ways. He says he received the 40 lashings minus one 5 times, and he was beaten with rods, and he was stoned, and somehow he didn't die when he was stoned. And he often lacked basic necessities. And even though going through all these things, he also had to carry with him the anxiety of helping these churches that he was growing. And God gave him also an affliction that he had to deal with his whole life. And there's countless others. In the early days of Christianity, there was so much suffering, and it's just remarkable. I'm going to read from Hebrews at the end of sort of like the Hall of Faith of Hebrews. The writer of Hebrews talks about other unnamed individuals. There are others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. And they were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. So I apologize for being a little emotional there, but there are so many great examples of these people who lived under persecution, but they had endurance. And obviously, I missed the most important person in this list. We have Jesus himself, who came into the world with joy to suffer for us. And Jesus was betrayed, and he was deserted by his friends. He was falsely accused. He was found to be guiltless, but the mob wanted him dead anyway. And so he was flogged and handed over to be crucified. But he wasn't really handed over to be crucified. He chose to be crucified. He willingly did that. And so Jesus, for us, is the ultimate example, because while we were still his enemies, he wanted to suffer for us. And let's see, I think I've got a verse for that, but I'll read it later. This is why Paul says when we're trying to make new Christians, don't use clever words and try and persuade people to become Christians. Instead, just preach Jesus, because his story is so powerful. And when we try to persuade people, I can prove to you need to become a Christian, we're kind of removing the power of the cross when we do that. But I've listed for you guys a crazy amount of people who've suffered. And so it's kind of like we have a packed stadium of people who are cheering us on to have endurance through this life. So it's like we're running this race, and there's all these people who are cheering us on who've gone before us to do this. And so I'll read from Hebrews 12, kind of just after this Hall of Faith passage. Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with endurance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. So Paul, he loves speaking in this athletic terms because it helps us understand. There's another passage that talks about running the race as if to win, and you'll receive the crown of life. But as we're running, when we stumble, God is there to lift us up. He's not there to zap us when we stumble. He's not waiting for us to stumble and be like, haha, I get to torment you. He's there to pick us up and give us endurance to go through the hard times that are set before us. And so I hope this lesson today was an encouragement to you. And so thanks for enduring through all that. But that's all I have for today.